Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ancient Critics Podcast. Today, we will be talking about four different major revolutions, which are the Industrial Revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution, Russian Revolution.
All right, so my name is Katherine, and I'll be speaking for this portion of revolutions. And
my name is Daniel, and you'll probably hear me for all of the war-related stuff.
A lot of it.
Hi, my name is Medy, and I'll be talking about
American Revolution.
Yes, American Revolution. Yeah, so first things first, timeline order, the Industrial Revolution.
Yep, the Industrial Revolution, I say we start off with because of the fact that it's probably the most important revolution of its time period and the one that influenced some of the other revolutions, especially the Russian Revolution. And so the Industrial Revolution started in, I think, Great Britain, right?
Yes,
During
the first one started, there was second, and there's two Industrial Revolutions, the first one is the most well-known, and that started in Great Britain. And that happened in the 18th century, I think 1769, right?
It was about 1 year before the American Revolution?
Yeah, 70s-60s-ish. Yeah.
So, what actually happened in the Industrial Revolution again?
Well, in the Industrial Revolution, it's the beginning of basically factories. So now people could manufacture textiles and products that we daily use and consume in factories, basically, and we don't have to make it by hand anymore. Those are available thanks to like the scientific revolutions and all these inventions that were being made. Machines were invented and factories were made, and that's how the Industrial Revolution started. And it did change the course of history a lot. And you could talk about perhaps the effect and your favorite subject.
So, the Industrial Revolution, from what I know of it, is that especially during the era of colonialism, ruined a lot of other countries like China and India because of the fact that when the Europeans arrived and they started industrializing, it prevented all of those artisans or people who made handcrafts themselves. It just stopped them from doing their job because now they can produce the same thing but 10 times faster and 10 times the amount. And it actually led to a very important ideology, which was communism, because with the separation between the working class and the wealthy elites, Karl Marx, a German, came up with the idea that in communism, everyone has to be able to access resources equally.
And most of the people who supported the Communist Manifesto, which Karl Marx wrote, were working class. And the working class originally had a lot of complaints. Like, they did not like the situation because a lot of the working class were forced to work a lot. And they were like, some kids were forced, like there was a lot of child labor. But richer people got richer and then poor people were still poor. So there was a lot of just complaints about this whole society system.
My question though is that why did it start in Britain out of all the other European countries, I think maybe, do you think that it's because of the fact that they had kind of an era of peace at that time? Like, they weren't really fighting any major wars, and their empire was getting, like, really, really big. So I would say around that, right? Because around that time, afterwards, they had the American and then the French. And the French at that time were also really unhappy. And the Russians were also not very stable. And the Germans were still split up. So I think that's a good reason for the revolution happening in Britain, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Britain was a united country, unlike Italy or Prussia. Well, not Prussia yet, Germany, let's say. And the French weren't having too much of a good time in the 1760s and 80s, 70s, Britain had some things, but they were pretty stable. And there were a lot of scientists from Britain too, like Newton later on, Newton.
the American Revolution.
I mean, it was also because of they had to pay taxes, but then they didn't get any representation within the British government. So you pay money, but you don't get any benefit from it. So that made a lot of people mad. Yeah, and then also a famous person published a book called Common Sense, which has these ideas of equality and how it kind of points out how the monarchy is kind of old and wrong because everyone was equal, and that got a huge boom in like in America and the U.S. So that kind of those factors contributed to the outbreak of the American Revolution.
I mean, it's kind of funny that a lot of people still call them Americans at that time period because they still would have been considered British citizens, as they technically haven't gotten their independence yet. But what exactly happened in the American Revolution?
So the American fight the British, the France and Spain kind of come and help American, and the British surrender in 1781, but it formally ended at 1783. Well, I think the French helped the American because they were mad at the British for fighting for the land, but I'm not sure with the Spain.
Do you have any idea, Catherine?
About
Why the French and the Spanish helped the Americans against the British?
I mean, for France always hated the British. We all know that. And the British and the French were always rivals. So if Britain loses like important colonies that produces a lot of tobacco, that produces a lot of resources, that's splendid for France. They don't want. And I think the Spanish also helped that because of that reason, because they didn't want Britain to gain more power. That's in my opinion, because Britain was getting a lot of power, like starting to get a lot of power, because this is not right before, but nearly before the Victorian era, which was the era of greatest of their colonies later on, 100 years later. But, I think as British rivals, the French tried to stop Britain from gaining more power. I think that's why. And just, helping the Americans, never did they know that they will also have a revolution later on.
Which is funny for me, because didn't the Americans later on attack them in the Spanish-American War, like to take over the Philippines?
They could have, yeah, I think.
Yeah. That was just kind of funny for me, because the Americans later kind of, I don't know, really betrayed their friendship with the Spanish for attacking them.
And then they later on, kind of tease France in media and like YouTube, like French, the white flag people, huh?
Which isn't wrong.
No, come on, literally. At least the Americans can't say that to the French.
Yeah, well, I think that's all for our American.
Also, remember like during the American Revolution, famous people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, during
Paul
that
Revere.
time. Yeah, it was really the establishment of the United States. Yeah, so it was such an important period. What would have happened if America was still part of Britain?
Technically, they were all still British at that time.
Yeah, but like to this day, Britain would have been so much stronger.
Yeah. If America actually didn't gain its independence, we might still have imperialism today, because especially after World War II, America was like the main contributing factor to getting rid of European imperialism. They were telling all the European countries to give their colonies independence. They're basically twisting everyone's hands.
They were bossing around America. Like, it was such a small country.
Which is good for my country.
Which is also good for my country, sir. Sir, let's not talk about colonies.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyways.
Next.
All right, and I think we can go on to our next topic, the French Revolution.
Yes, and my favorite revolutions of all time, I would say, is France. And France had three major revolutions. And first one is the 1789 revolution. This is the most famous revolution, where Louis XVI was killed and chopped his head on the guillotine. And then the next one is the 1830 revolution, the 1830 revolution, and then we have the 1848 revolution. So basically, the first revolution, what do you know about the first revolution, Daniel? The 1789, it's the most well-known one.
Yeah, I would say that revolution is probably the most iconic French Revolution and the most well-known revolution. What I know of it is that they got rid of the monarchy and turned France into a republic instead of a monarchy. That's what I know of the French Revolution.
So basically, that is all right. The cause of the first French Revolution is first, I would say the first one is the social. So in the late 18th century, there were like the social structures in France were extremely unequal and exploitative. For example, the clergy and the nobility had to pay so little taxes, and the 99% other peasants who already were broke had to pay like 90%, more than 90% of the whole tax income. So that was a lot for the French to deal with, and they're like, we're not going to deal with. And there was a lot of middle class growing, especially after the fall of the feudal regime. So like after the fall of knights and lords and everything, there was a lot of middle class called bourgeoisie.
I know this because of communism.
Yeah, and they resented this condition. They wanted to be part of the politics because they're like, we have money, we are middle class, we want to play a part, we want to play a role in politics, just like the Americans wanted to play a role in the British politics. That would directly affect them. And another one was the economic reasons. So basically France went broke trying to help the Americans. So basically the French didn't have like money, so like a lot of people were mad that they didn't have money. And you know what happens when there are hungry peasants? A lot of bad things happen when there are hungry peasants in the world. And politically, Louis XVI, the king at that time, was extremely kind of like, what we say, he wasn't like a good king. He was kind of like a bad king. He didn't do anything. Like he just wanted to make clocks and watches. That was what he wanted to do, but he was stuck up during the King of France. So yeah, he didn't have anything to do basically. So like political situations were escalating quickly. Things were changing quickly. People's thoughts were changing quickly. The economic situation was also changing quickly, but he could not adapt to any of these situations. So the failure of adaptation is one of the greatest reasons. And also the last one is probably the intellectual. Like as we said, people started to think more and more about equality, about like what makes us different from that king? Like, why aren't we all equal people? And these ideas were well expressed in Voltaire, Descartes, and like Rousseau. These people all contributed to these philosophies, and France was the country who read most of these philosophies. So yeah, like your favorite philosophy later on, but.
So basically, the revolution could have been prevented if the French people weren't taught how to read.
Yes, it could happen. This is why you don't teach peasants. But yes, yeah, French were great educated and they loved thinking. France still to this day loves thinking, and philosophy plays a big role in France. Yeah.
And so the French Revolution, wasn't it extremely bloody and violent?
Yes. And I've invited a friend. She's WaWa, and she can talk a little bit about what kind of important events happened in the first revolution.
So on like a time frame, the first revolution, the first thing that happened in the revolution is Estates General and Third Estates, right?
Yes.
And basically, it's the first meeting hosted by Estates General, and
Estates is the class, like the middle class, the lower class, the higher class, etc.
And yes, they issued the problem and like had a discussion and take notes on the grievance of the citizens. And so these are the meeting between the middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1964, most of the middle class people were 98% of the population.
Yeah. That's why they were mad. Mm-hmm. And then later on, the storming of the Bastilles and then the tennis court oath. Well, the tennis court oath was when basically the clergy and nobles started to resist the representations of the Third Estates. And then, yeah, so basically they had a meeting, and the meeting, basically like this, they had some meetings, and the meeting didn't go well. And then the peasants later on stormed to the Bastilles, and then they killed a lot of nobles, basically. And then still the issue wasn't resolved, and the nobility was still not willing to change, so the French Revolution eventually broke out, and the people, got like people army, like citizen armies, and they literally went to the palace, and they seized the palace, they seized the government, they seized any infrastructure they could find, and then they basically gained control of the government, and this started the Reign of Terror by our dearest Robespierre. Robespierre was this really extremist guy who wanted to just kill all the nobles, and he was really extreme. He believed in equality, and he was basically the person who was in charge of the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is the bloody time you just talked about, like Daniel talked about. People were chopped off in the guillotine, like people's head were here and there, and this is... Yeah, so Napoleon was this guy who just came along, and because people were so sick of this Reign of Terror and everyone dying, they wanted something stability. When people are too radical, they now want stability. So they chose a strong emperor called Napoleon who would give them stability, but he later, fell apart. And then he later was defeated at the Waterloo, and then the European powers brought the Bourbons in, which was the formal dynasty. And then the revolution in 1830 was because of this. So basically the French people thought that the new king was called Louis the 18th, the brother of Louis the 16th, who got decapitated like in 1792. The people believed that he was kind of ignoring the revolution, and there was no effect of the revolution. So they decided to throw him out. So they did actually throw him out and change it to a new king. And he was from the Orleans dynasty. So the revolution in 1830 is basically just changing kings. And the revolution in 1848 is when Napoleon III came in, the nephew of Napoleon. So a lot of Napoleons and a lot of Louis at this time. It could be summed up in two words, Louis and Napoleon.
Yep.
And basically at this time, the new king they didn't elect it, but they kind of appointed it. He fails everyone. He can't keep a good political stance. He is in the middle of everything, so he's not too radical enough, but he's not too conservative enough. And he was just right in the middle. Like he can't do, like he was like, I'm trying to listen to the radical side, but I'm also trying to listen to the conservative time. So he can't make a decision. Everyone's mad at him. Everyone's disappointed. So they throw him again. They overthrow their king again for the third time, and then he's actually really short. This guy is really short. Napoleon III, whose height was 153 centimeters, came along, and he's like, I'm going to bring back the glorious French Empire. And then the people elected him as president, and he later declares himself emperor. And that's basically the French Revolution. The revolution goes back to dynasties.
Well, now that we're done with the French Revolution, I think we can move on to the last and finally one of my favorites, the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution, it happened like very, very later than all of these other revolutions, which happened pretty close to each other. The Russian Revolution happened during World War I, because the Russian people were not very happy with how Russia was doing in the war and losing against the Germans. It was also because of a very long-standing problem inside Russia, where the peasants were still stuck in a serfdom kind of system, where all of their land was completely owned and controlled by the monarchy. But later, Tsar Nicholas, the famous and last Russian emperor, his grandfather would actually release all of the peasants from their serfdom. The only problem was that now they were in huge amounts of debt because they had to pay back a lot of money for being released from their owners' services. And so, do you guys know anything else about the Russian Revolution?
I mean, also, Russia was, behind Europe a lot, by any, technology and politically wise. At that time, Britain was installing constitutional monarchy. France was a republic. Prussia kind of not. But, France and Britain was, in this new modern era. But Russia was not. Russia was falling behind. They only had farming devices. They did not have any technology. And people were mad because of that. They were mad, and they were seeing this Europe, and they were comparing. They were like, what happened to us? So this anger grew more and more.
Yeah, the problem was mainly with the Tsars. They refused to modernize Russia and industrialize like all of the other countries, and they only industrialized far later on. And also, they spent all of the country's money just to host parties for the nobility, while the people were too poor to be able to do anything. They were just forced to keep working, otherwise they would be brutally oppressed or killed. You have a question, WaWa? Or
So I just have a question, like what does a Tsar mean? And when I think of the French Revolution, I think it's something related to SARS.
So the Tsar is kind of like the Russian version of like, it's their word for emperor basically. It's the same thing as a French king. It's just the Russian word for their emperor. Also, it's kind of different because France at that time was still a kingdom. They weren't like a full empire yet. It was only when like Napoleon came and the French after that made them an empire that they technically had an emperor. Russia was really big at that time, and they controlled land in like Alaska, and so then that's why they had emperors. So the difference is that France was still a kingdom at that time, so they were kings, and Russia was an empire, so they had emperors. Another problem that just happened with the Russian Revolution, which caused it, was that Tsar Nicholas's father, he caused a lot of instability, and he actually did the very opposite of his own father. He repressed the people, he oppressed the people, and took away their rights. And so then while his dad was trying to improve Russia, he was trying to basically bring Russia back down and give himself and the monarchy and the nobility more power. But later on, he would fortunately die, and so then Nicholas would take power. But he didn't teach Nicholas at all how to rule his country, and Nicholas even said himself that he did not know how to rule his giant empire. And so then that was kind of unfortunate for him, especially since the French and would ask him for his help in fighting the Germans in World War I. And so then the problem with Nicholas too was that he wasn't the most competent leader. He said that he made friends with this man, I think you would all know him, Rasputin, made famous,
Rasputin,
lover of the Russian queen. And so then him and his wife liked Rasputin because he was this basically magical, crazy Russian wizard.
Wasn't his like son like sick, and then there was like no doctor could save his son, but then Rasputin just came out of nowhere and like kind of healed him, and then like Alexandria, what was the wife's name? Tsar Nicholas's wife's name, Alexandria or something like that.
I think so.
Alexandria.
Yeah.
The thing is that like with the whole sun healing thing, what they most likely think happened was that Rasputin just took away the doctor's medication, which was not helping improving their son's condition. But they didn't know that. They thought it was magic at that time because they got like all the best doctors to try help their son. None of it worked. Then they get this magical crazy wizard off the street and he just cures their son. And so they made like really good friends with him. They let him he basically lived like a Tsar too. And the people of Russia did not like this, just seeing this crazy guy being like, practically in charge. And then later on in World War II, Tsar Nicholas would go on to like try to fight and like lead the army himself. But he wasn't really that good, and Russia didn't have the supplies to feed their soldiers. And so then this was a problem because if your people are unhappy, but you have your military, you can still control your people. But now if your military is getting unhappy, then you basically lose almost all of your power because the military is the only thing keeping you on the throne. And many of the Russian soldiers during World War I were deserting because they didn't even have, like when they went to the Eastern Front, the Russia couldn't even provide them with their own winter equipment or even guns. Sometimes they would just have to pick up weapons and guns off of their fallen comrades. And one of the huge major factors for the revolution was when a priest from the Russian Orthodox Church tried to make a peaceful protest with thousands of other civilians, and they wanted Tsar Nicholas to basically make some reformation that gave them some more rights, that made made them a bit more equal, that gave them food and whatnot so then they wouldn't be starving. But Tsar Nicholas was scared, and so he ordered his military to fire on the peaceful protesters in what was known as Bloody Sunday, and this is what led up to the Russian Revolution. And there were actually two different groups that were fighting in the revolution. You had the ordinary peasants and civilians, But then you also had the workers, and the workers were the communists. And so then what happened was that they took over. Tsar Nicholas and his entire family was sent off to some faraway coal mines, and they were basically put into confinement. And the problem after the revolution was that there were two governments that were being set up. There was a communist government, and there was the Republican government. And the problem was that there was a very, what would you call it?
Divide?
Yeah, there was a divide between them, and it was what do you call the power balance again when it's really weak? Just
Like the stability.
yeah,
was
the
low?
stability of the power was like shifting from one side to another, but that all changed when our favorite communist Lenin came in. And Lenin, with his right-hand man, the famous Joseph Stalin, would basically establish the communists into power, and they would get rid of the Republican government that was trying to host democracies and whatnot. And another reason that contributed to the Republican government's downfall was the fact that they had a military coup staged against them. And so then the democratic government basically tried to arm the communists with guns to help defend against the coup. And after the coup was over, all the communists had guns, but the democratic government didn't have any more weapons. And so that was a reason why the government failed. And the communists, fearing that Tsar Nicholas might come back, killed him and his entire family, which is pretty tragic because most of them didn't even do anything, and they didn't even know what was happening. And in the final stages of the Russian Revolution, they had the White Army and the Red Army. The Red Army was the communists, and the White Army were all of the Russian citizens and ex-soldiers who wanted to bring back the old form of they wanted to bring back the old, like, Russian government, like the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, the White Army would lose, and this would lead to the establishment of the Soviet Union.
Was much more simpler with less of an ideology, but it was similar in a way that like the government was overthrown. But since there's more ideology that was added in the 21st century, it becomes a lot of complicated. The 20th century became a lot complicated, and that's all for I think today, right? So we covered Industrial Revolution, we covered the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution. Each revolution is unique to its own era. And I think that's it for today, and thank you for listening, and bye. See you next time.